Winter, 1943. A medical clinic in Rozwadów, occupied Poland. The examining room is cold. 2 doctors stand over a patient, a young Jewish woman hiding under forged papers. Her hands shake as she rolls up her sleeve. Outside, German patrols move through the streets. Dr. Eugeniusz Wazowski draws a syringe filled with clear liquid. Not medicine, not poison, something stranger. A bacterial solution that will make this woman test positive for typhus without giving her the disease itself. It's a medical forgery, a biological lie. And if it works, it might save her life. Because when Germans see typhus, they don't invade. They quarantine. They retreat. They seal entire towns and never come back. But one failed blood test, one suspicious inspector, one inconsistency in the pattern, and everyone involved dies. You need to grasp something critical right now. Typhus terrified the German military more than partisan ambushes, more than sabotage. The disease had devastated armies for centuries. German command issued strict protocols. Any area showing epidemic-level infection rates gets isolated immediately. No exceptions. No investigations. Just quarantine and avoidance. Wazowski and his colleague, Dr. Stanisław Matulewicz, discovered a loophole in that fear. The vial Felix test, the standard diagnostic used by German health authorities, detected antibodies against typhus. But it had a flaw. It also reacted to a harmless bacterium called Proteus ox-19. Inject someone with dead Proteus bacteria, and they'd test positive for typhus. No fever, no rash, no lice, no actual infection, just a false positive result on paper. And papers were what Germans trusted. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how 2 physicians weaponized a diagnostic test, how they convinced occupying forces that entire villages were plague zones, and how a fabricated epidemic became one of the war's most audacious medical deceptions. You'll see the moment German inspectors arrived to verify the outbreak and nearly unraveled the entire scheme, how the doctors manufactured symptoms in healthy people, and why historians still debate exactly how many lives this impossible gamble actually saved. This isn't a story about combat or resistance fighters. This is about 2 men who turned medicine into camouflage, who made health look like disease, who understood that sometimes the best way to protect people is to make the enemy believe they're contagious. The estimates vary wildly. Some accounts suggest 8,000 people shielded from deportation and labor conscription. Others focus on smaller numbers, Jews specifically, hidden in homes throughout the quarantine zones. The truth is, we'll never know the exact count because the deception required no records, no documentation, no evidence that would survive German scrutiny. What we do know is this: Rozwadów and surrounding villages became untouchable. German soldiers stopped entering, roundup ceased, labor transport quotas went unfulfilled, and all of it hinged on test results that were meticulously, deliberately false. Listen closely, because in just a moment you'll discover the single detail that almost destroyed everything. The anomaly German authorities couldn't ignore, the statistical pattern that should have been impossible and that triggered the inspection that could have ended with mass executions. Before we go further, if this kind of deep wartime history grabs you, the kind that uncovers strategies that don't fit the usual narrative of guns and battles, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. It tells me this matters to you, and it keeps me digging into these hidden chapters. And drop a comment on this. If you were a doctor in occupied territory with the ability to fake an epidemic, would you risk it? Knowing that exposure doesn't just mean your death, but the death of everyone you tried to protect, would you take that gamble? I want to know where you draw that line. All right, let's dig in. But first, we need to rewind to 1941. To the moment Eugeniusz Wazowski arrived in Rozwadów and realized the town was trapped between 2 nightmares. Rozwadów sits in southeastern Poland near the San River, small, rural, unremarkable. By 1941, German occupation had been grinding for 2 years. Jewish populations were being systematically deported. Able-bodied Poles were being rounded up for forced labor in German factories. Villages were being drained of workers, of young men, of anyone the Reich deemed useful. Wazowski had trained in infectious diseases before the war. The background made him valuable to the Germans, who needed local doctors to monitor public health and report outbreaks. It also made him dangerous, because he understood something most physicians didn't. He understood the bureaucratic machinery of epidemic control. When a disease outbreak occurred, German health authorities followed rigid protocols. Reports went up the chain. Inspectors arrived, blood samples were collected and tested. Results were filed. If confirmed, quarantine measures activated automatically. The system ran on paperwork and lab results. It assumed those results were accurate. Wazowski saw the vulnerability immediately. Sometime in late 1942, he reunited with his former professor, Stanisław Matulewicz, who was practicing nearby. The two began discussing a theoretical problem. Could you fake a typhus outbreak convincingly enough to fool German authorities? Not a real outbreak. Those killed indiscriminately. But a phantom epidemic. something that existed only on paper and in blood tests. The Weil-Felix test made it possible. The test worked by detecting antibodies the body produced when fighting typhus. Those antibodies cross-reacted with certain strains of Proteus bacteria. It was a known limitation of the test, mentioned in medical literature, but rarely relevant in practice. Wazowski realized it could become very relevant. Proteus OX19 wasn't dangerous. You could culture it safely. You could kill it with heat, rendering it completely harmless. And you could inject those dead bacteria into a patient. The patient's immune system would react. Antibodies would form. And when German inspectors drew blood for testing, the Weil-Felix test would light up positive. The patient would appear infected. But they'd feel fine. That gap between how someone looked and what the test showed was where the deception lived. The first test happened quietly. A farmer from a nearby village, someone Wazowski trusted, agreed to be injected. The dose was small. The bacteria were dead. The man went home. 3 days later, Wazowski drew blood and sent it to the German medical office for testing. Result: positive for typhus. The Germans contacted Wazowski immediately. They wanted to know about additional cases. Were there more infections? Was this an isolated incident or the start of an outbreak? Wazowski reported that he was monitoring several other patients with suspicious symptoms. He'd test them soon. He injected 5 more people. All tested positive. Now the Germans were paying attention. German health officials arrived within the week. They wanted to inspect the clinic, interview patients, verify the outbreak was real. This was the first critical test, not of the bacteria, of the performance. Because the patients weren't sick. They had no fever, no rash, no delirium. If German inspectors examined them closely, the deception would collapse immediately. Wazowski's solution was elegant and terrifying in its simplicity. He told the Germans the patients were in the early stages. Symptoms hadn't fully developed yet. He recommended the inspectors avoid direct contact to minimize infection risk. He emphasized that typhus spread through lice, and these rural homes were likely infested. German inspectors had no desire to contract typhus. They kept their distance. Wazowski brought them to homes where patients lay in bed, looking exhausted and weak. Not difficult to fake in occupied Poland, where everyone was malnourished and exhausted. The inspectors didn't linger. They took Wazowski's word, reviewed his documentation, and left. The quarantine designation went into effect shortly after. Rozwadów and several surrounding hamlets were marked as typhus zones. German personnel were instructed to avoid the area except for essential business. No labor roundups, no random inspections, no deportations. The invisible wall had gone up, and now Wazowski faced a new problem. The outbreak couldn't just disappear. If cases suddenly stopped, Germans would lift the quarantine. The area would become vulnerable again. So the epidemic had to continue, month after month. New cases appearing regularly, but never escalating into a crisis that would demand German medical intervention or hospitalization. It was a tightrope. Too few cases, and the quarantine ends. Too many, and German authorities send their own medical teams to take over. Wazowski and Matulovic began injecting people systematically. Farmers, villagers, families, hiding Jews in attics and cellars. Anyone who needed protection from German scrutiny. The injections were free. The patients were coached. When German officials made occasional inquiries, Wazowski submitted reports showing a persistent, low-level outbreak. Endemic, but contained. Dangerous enough to maintain the quarantine, controlled enough not to trigger panic. The paperwork was immaculate. Patient names, test dates, results. Everything filed properly. Everything following German administrative requirements. Because the deception wasn't just medical, it was bureaucratic. Germans trusted systems. They trusted documentation. Wazowski gave them exactly what they expected, an unfortunate but manageable public health situation in a rural backwater not worth the risk of direct oversight. For months, it worked flawlessly. Jewish families hidden in the quarantine zone remained hidden. Young men avoiding forced labor conscription stayed home. The villages existed in a strange bubble, isolated by a disease that didn't exist. But then the numbers started looking wrong. By mid-1943, German health authorities in the regional command began reviewing epidemic statistics. Rozwadow's outbreak had been ongoing for over a year, hundreds of positive test results. But the death rate was bizarrely low. Typhus killed approximately 10 to 40% of those infected, depending on conditions and treatment availability. In occupied Poland, with limited medical resources, mortality should have been on the higher end. Rozwadow's mortality rate was nearly zero. Patients tested positive, were documented as infected, and then recovered. All of them. No mass graves, no reports of bodies, no requests for additional medical supplies to manage severe cases. Someone in the German Health Administration noticed, and that someone flagged it for investigation. Eugeniusz Wazowski learned about the inquiry through a contact, a Polish clerk working in the German medical office who saw the paperwork being prepared. An inspection team was being assembled, not local officials, not regional health staff, German physicians from the Reich. experienced epidemiologists who would come to Roswadov, conduct their own examinations, draw their own blood samples, and possibly send those samples to laboratories in Germany for independent testing. If that happened, the deception was over, because the tests in Roswadov were processed by Polish lab technicians who understood what Wazowski was doing. They reported positive results because they knew those results protected their community. German labs in Reich territory wouldn't be complicit. They'd test, honestly, and they'd discover that the samples showed antibodies against Proteus bacteria, not typhus. The entire scheme would unravel, and everyone involved would be executed. Wazowski had days to prepare, maybe a week. He couldn't stop the inspection. Refusing access would confirm German suspicions. He couldn't evacuate the patients. Moving hundreds of people would be impossible and conspicuous. He had to let the German team come, had to let them examine patients, draw blood, ask questions, and somehow convince them the outbreak was real. The inspection team arrived on a cold morning in late 1943. 3 German doctors, a senior health administrator, and a Gestapo observer. The Gestapo presence was the detail that turned Wazowski's fear into something colder. This wasn't just a medical inquiry. This was a security investigation. The Germans suspected something, maybe not the full truth, but enough to send someone whose job was finding deception. Wazowski met them at the clinic. Professional, calm, deferential. He had prepared files for review. Charts showing infection timelines. Test results organized chronologically. The German lead physician was skeptical from the start. He asked pointed questions. Why so few deaths? Why were patients recovering without hospital care? Why hadn't the outbreak spread beyond this specific cluster of villages? Wazowski had answers ready. He explained that typhus mortality varied significantly based on the strain. He suggested this particular outbreak might be a less virulent variant. He noted that early detection and basic supportive care, rest, hydration, isolation, could improve outcomes dramatically. He was lying with medical precision. Every false answer wrapped in enough legitimate science to sound plausible. The German physician wasn't convinced, but he couldn't immediately disprove anything either. Then came the demand that nearly ended everything. The lead doctor wanted to examine patients personally, not from a distance, direct physical examination. He wanted to check for the characteristic rash, feel for fever, assess symptoms firsthand. Wazowski's mind raced. The patients had no rash. Most had no fever. They were healthy people pretending to be sick. A thorough examination would expose them instantly. Wazowski made a decision that required extraordinary nerve. He agreed immediately. No hesitation, no resistance. He offered to take the German team to patient homes right away. Then he added one detail, delivered casually, almost as an afterthought. He mentioned that several of the patients were in the infectious stage, highly contagious. The homes were small, poorly ventilated, likely swarming with lice. He could provide the Germans with protective measures, but transmission risk would be significant. He said all of this while standing close to the German doctors. Too close, invading their space slightly. The psychological effect was immediate. These were physicians who understood epidemiology. Who knew that typhus spread through lice? Who knew that close contact in cramped, infested spaces was exactly how transmission occurred? The lead doctor stepped back. He conferred with his colleagues quietly. Then he made a decision that saved hundreds of lives. He told Wazowski they'd examine a sample of patients only, 3 or 4, and they'd conduct those examinations outdoors when possible, minimizing exposure time. Wazowski agreed readily. He suggested specific patients, people he'd coached extensively, people who could simulate symptoms convincingly. The examinations happened quickly. German doctors checked pulses, looked briefly at skin, asked about symptoms. The patients complained of headaches, body aches, fatigue. They looked pale and weak, which wasn't hard given the circumstances of occupation. Nothing definitive, nothing that confirmed typhus, but nothing that definitively ruled it out either. The Germans drew blood samples, several vials from different patients. This was the moment of maximum danger. If those samples went to a German laboratory, the deception ended. Wazowski watched the vials being labeled and packed. His expression remained professionally neutral. Inside, he was calculating odds and outcomes. The senior German administrator asked about testing facilities. He wanted to know where samples had been processed previously. Wazowski explained he'd been using a Polish lab in the regional hospital. He offered to have these new samples tested there as well, results delivered within days. The German considered this. Then he asked a question that made the air feel thinner. He wanted to know why, if the outbreak was real, there were no requests for additional medical supplies, no requisitions for fever reducers, antibiotics, supportive care medications. The paperwork showed tests and diagnoses, but almost no treatment documentation. It was a sharp observation, the kind that comes from someone trained to spot inconsistencies. Wazowski's answer had to be perfect. He explained that supplies were severely limited under occupation. He'd been managing with basic interventions: rest, fluids, isolation. He noted that formal requisitions often went unfilled, so he'd stopped submitting them. He mentioned that many patients were too poor to afford medication anyway. Every word was calibrated, every explanation just plausible enough. The German administrator wrote notes. His expression was unreadable. Then the Gestapo observer spoke for the first time. He asked Wazowski directly, "Was there any possibility these test results were being manipulated?" The room went silent. Wazowski looked him in the eye, held the gaze, and said no. His reputation as a physician was built on accurate diagnosis. He'd welcome any independent verification. It was a bluff executed with absolute conviction. The Gestapo man studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. The inspection team left that afternoon. They took the blood samples. They took copies of patient files. They told Wazowski they'd submit a report, and he'd hear about any further requirements. For days afterward, Wazowski waited. Every knock on the door could be Gestapo. Every message could be a summons. The blood samples were the vulnerability he couldn't control. If Germans tested them independently, if they bypassed the Polish lab, if they analyzed the antibody patterns closely, but the report never came. What arrived instead, weeks later, was a routine administrative notice. Rozwadow's quarantine status was confirmed and extended. No further investigation required. Wazowski never learned exactly why. The most likely explanation: the German team's report noted irregularities, but concluded they were consistent with wartime medical practice under resource constraints. The area was rural, poor, medically underserved. Low mortality might reflect early detection and isolation rather than fraud. Or perhaps the German doctors simply didn't want to spend more time in a potential typhus zone. Perhaps bureaucratic inertia and fear of infection outweighed investigative thoroughness. Whatever the reason, the inspection ended. The quarantine held, and the invisible shield remained in place until liberation. When Soviet forces reached Rozwadow in 1944, the epidemic quietly disappeared. No more injections, no more false positives. The outbreak that had lasted nearly 2 years ended instantly. Wazowski and Matulewicz never publicized what they'd done during the war. Security concerns remained even after German retreat. The scheme stayed secret for years. It wasn't until the 1960s that Wazowski finally disclosed the full story. By then, enough time had passed. People who might have faced repercussions were beyond reach, and the medical deception had faded into historical footnote territory. Estimates of how many people were protected vary wildly. Some sources cite roughly 8 zero-hour individuals shielded from deportation and labor conscription. The number specifically saved from death, Jews hidden in the quarantine zone, resistance members avoiding capture, remains uncertain. What historians agree on: the deception worked. It protected a region. It kept German forces at bay using nothing but falsified test results and performative illness. Wazowski himself was modest about the achievement. In interviews decades later, he described it as a small trick that happened to succeed. He downplayed the audacity, the risk, the methodical maintenance of an elaborate medical fiction under Gestapo scrutiny. But modest or not, the scheme was extraordinary for what it revealed about occupation dynamics. German forces, despite their brutality, despite their willingness to commit atrocities, operated within systems. They followed protocols, they trusted documentation, and they feared disease. That fear created exploitable space, a gap between perception and reality that 2 doctors weaponized with remarkable precision. After the war, Wazowski emigrated to the United States. He practiced medicine in Illinois. He became a professor. He lived quietly until his death in 2006 at age 93. Matulewicz stayed in Poland. He continued medical practice. He rarely discussed the wartime deception publicly. He died in 1968. Neither man received widespread recognition during their lifetimes. No major medals, no international honors. The scheme they'd executed remained obscure outside medical history circles. But in recent years, interest has resurged. Holocaust educators have highlighted the story as an example of nonviolent resistance. Medical ethicists have analyzed it as a case study in deception for humanitarian purposes. Historians have debated its effectiveness and scope. And that debate is worth understanding because it touches on something crucial about historical memory. We want stories like this to have clean numbers, exact figures. This action saved X lives. But resistance during occupation rarely worked that way. How do you count people who weren't deported because a labor quota went unfilled? How do you identify individuals who avoided capture because German patrols stopped entering a quarantine zone? How do you measure the indirect effects of a deception that created space for other forms of resistance? You can't, not with precision. What you can say is this: Rozwadow and surrounding villages experienced significantly fewer deportations and labor conscriptions than comparable areas. Jewish families hiding in the region had a higher survival rate than those in non-quarantine zones. German documentation from the period shows the area was deliberately avoided due to epidemic concerns. The The cause and effect relationship is clear even if the exact numbers remain elusive. And perhaps that's fitting, because the deception's power came from its invisibility. It worked because it left no trail, no dramatic rescues, no confrontations, just bureaucratic paperwork showing an unfortunate but manageable disease outbreak. The quietness was the point. Now let me show you why this matters beyond historical curiosity. Why a medical deception from 1943 still resonates in how we think about resistance, authority, and expertise today. First, it demonstrates that systems designed for control contain vulnerabilities. German occupation relied on bureaucratic infrastructure, documentation, testing, health protocols. That infrastructure assumed accuracy and compliance. Wazowski exploited that assumption by feeding the system false data it had no reason to question. The lesson scales. Authoritarian systems, precisely because they depend on rigid protocols and centralized information, become vulnerable when that information is corrupted. Small acts of bureaucratic sabotage can create disproportionate effects. Second, the scheme illustrates how expertise grants access to deception. Wazowski and Matulewicz succeeded because they were credible. They were doctors. They spoke the language of medicine. They understood what German health authorities expected to see. Their professional legitimacy made their lies believable. That's a double-edged insight. It shows how professional credibility can be leveraged for good. But it also reveals how easily expertise can be weaponized for manipulation. The same dynamics that let Wazowski fake an epidemic could enable medical professionals to falsify data for harmful purposes. Trust in expertise requires verification, especially, when the expert seems confident and credible. Third, the story highlights the role of fear in authority structures. German forces feared typhus. That fear overrode their investigative instincts. When the inspection team had the opportunity to examine patients closely, to dig deeper into irregularities, they retreated instead. Fear makes powerful institutions risk-averse, and risk aversion creates opportunities for those willing to exploit it. Finally, the fake epidemic reveals something about resistance narratives we often overlook. We celebrate dramatic acts, sabotage, armed combat, daring rescues. Those are important, but most resistance during occupation was quieter. Forged documents, hidden refugees, small deceptions maintained consistently over time. Wazowski's scheme worked because it was boring, a persistent, low-level health problem. Nothing dramatic, nothing that demanded attention. Just enough of a nuisance to keep Germans away. The most effective resistance often looks like bureaucratic tedium. But there's a darker question embedded in all of this, one that makes the story more complex than simple heroism. Wazowski made decisions that put others at risk. Every person he injected became complicit. If the deception had been exposed, they'd have faced execution. He made that choice for them, often without explaining the full stakes. Was that justified? Did the outcome, protection from deportation, validate the methods? Or did Wazowski cross ethical lines by involving people in a scheme that could have gotten them killed? There's no clean answer. Occupied territories forced impossible choices. Wazowski believed the risk of exposure was lower than the risk of deportation. He gambled with lives that weren't only his own. He was right. The gamble paid off. But what if it hadn't? That question matters because it exposes the moral ambiguity of resistance. We lionize people who took risks and succeeded. We call them heroes. But if the same actions had failed and led to mass executions, we judge them very differently. Heroism and recklessness are often separated only by outcome. The morality doesn't change, just the results. So here's what I want you to consider. If you were in Wazowski's position, knowing that inaction meant certain deportations, but action meant potential exposure and executions, what would you do? Would you take the gamble? Would you involve others without their full consent? Would you trust your medical knowledge against Gestapo scrutiny? And here's the harder question. If Wazowski had asked permission, explained the full risk to every person before injecting them, and some had refused, what then? Would the scheme still work with partial participation? Or did it require universal compliance to maintain the illusion? Those aren't hypothetical puzzles. They're the reality of resistance. The messy, dangerous, morally ambiguous choices that don't fit into clean narratives of good versus evil. Wazowski made those choices. He lived with them. And whether you call him a hero, a gambler, or something in between, depends on how you weigh risk, consent, and outcome. Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you stand. And if this kind of hidden story is what you're here for, the schemes that don't make it into textbooks, the deceptions that saved lives without firing shots, subscribe. There are more of these tucked into archives and memoirs waiting to be told. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.